was a quiet September night in a small district of Guangzhou, China. The noodle shop had just closed for the day. The streets were nearly silent until a scream tore through the stillness. It was sharp, frantic, and unmistakably female. The owner of the noodle shop, Mrs. Ming, froze mid-cleaning. The scream had come from her young assistant, a 17-year-old girl named Qiáo Jiànguó. Moments earlier, she'd left to use the public restroom, just a short walk down a dim alley. Now she was screaming for her life. Neighbors came running. What they found would haunt them for years to come. Qiáo Jiànguó was lying on the ground, barely conscious. Her abdomen was ripped open. Her intestines were spilled out onto the cold concrete like something out of a horror movie. Blood pooled beneath her. The scene was so brutal some couldn't bear to look. A few had to turn away and vomit. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Even the lead surgeon, a man who had seen more than his fair share of horrific injuries, was momentarily speechless. The violence she endured wasn't just savage, it was precise. Someone had deliberately and skillfully pulled her internal organs out by hand. But here's the twist. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Just 1 month earlier, another young woman had been found dead by the roadside, her body posed in a grotesque and similar fashion. Her name was Lam Tu. Her killer had removed her intestines and wrapped them around her neck. 2 girls, 2 brutal attacks, 1 disturbing pattern. You might be wondering who could do something like this, and why. What was the connection between them? And more importantly, would he strike again? Qiáo Jiànguó's attack wasn't just a horrific incident, it was a piece in a far more chilling puzzle. Let's go back. September 2004, Binh Thuan Village, Guangzhou District. Mrs. Ming, owner of a humble noodle shop, had just seen off her last customer. Her assistant, Qiáo Jiànguó, a shy, hard-working girl from a struggling rural family, was wrapping up for the night. Qiáo Jiànguó was only 17. She'd dropped out of school to help support her sick father and younger siblings. That night, she excused herself to use the public restroom a few meters from the shop. Mrs. Ming offered her the chamber pot they kept inside, but Qiáo Jiànguó, embarrassed, declined. She stepped out into the dark alley.
And never made it back on her own.
Within minutes, the scream came. Mrs. Ming and neighbors found her barely breathing, her intestines torn from her body. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital where surgeons worked frantically to save her. Her injuries shocked even the most seasoned trauma doctors. Her small intestine had been pulled out, torn in several places, some parts irreparably damaged. Even more disturbing signs of assault suggested the attacker had used his hands, not a weapon. While Qiáo Jiànguó clung to life in surgery, the police scrambled for answers. Then a chilling realization surfaced. This wasn't the first case. Just a month earlier, on August 12, 2004, an elderly shepherd passing through a muddy dirt road spotted a woman lying motionless near a grove of trees. Assuming she'd tripped in the dark, he called out but got no response. When he lit his lighter to take a closer look, what he saw made him drop it in horror. The girl's neck was wrapped in her own intestines, pulled through her lower body. Her legs were splayed. She was already gone. That victim was Lam Tu, just 19, a migrant worker renting a room in Guangzhou. Witnesses and bystanders were traumatized. Some officers later admitted they'd never seen anything so brutal. Yet strangely, there was no evidence of robbery. Her phone money and personal items were untouched. She hadn't been sexually assaulted either. So what was the motive? The case stalled. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. Rain had washed away all traces. Forensics suggested the killer had knowledge of human anatomy. The way her intestines were removed indicated surgical precision. Investigators began profiling the suspect, perhaps a butcher or someone with medical training.
But without solid leads, the case went cold.
Until Qiáo Jiànguó. Her attack mirrored Lam Tu's so closely detectives were forced to consider a terrifying possibility. A serial predator was on the loose. Authorities reviewed recent police reports and found 2 other close calls. July 24th, a woman surnamed Tao had been waiting outside a BBQ shop for her husband when a man suddenly grabbed her by the neck and tried to drag her into an alley. He asked if she was Ha and seemed disoriented, possibly drunk. She screamed and her husband arrived just in time to scare the attacker off. August 15th, a woman named Ban reported that a man barged into her apartment after pretending to look for someone named Truong Van Minh. When she told him to leave, he became aggressive, accused her of lying, and tried to assault her. In the struggle, he reportedly reached down and clawed at her violently before fleeing. None of these incidents involved robbery, and none of the women were harmed the same way Lam Tu and Qiáo Jiànguó had been.
Still, the pieces were beginning to align.
Multiple women, a similar attacker description, no financial motive, no clear personal connection, just random violent targeting, and in the worst cases, a horrifying post-assault ritual involving organ removal. By mid-September, public fear in Kamjo turned to panic. Parents walked their daughters to and from work. Streets emptied earlier than usual. Women refused to go out alone at night. And behind the scenes, the police were racing against time. They began building a suspect list and quietly formed a special task force. Their first priority, get to Qiáo Jiànguó, now stabilized in the hospital, and hope she remembered anything that could point to her attacker.
What she told them would push the investigation forward and raise even more questions.
The moment Qiáo Jiànguó regained consciousness, detectives rushed to her bedside. She was barely able to speak, traumatized, trembling, and physically wrecked. But her words mattered. Between gasps, she described what little she remembered as she walked toward the restroom. Someone suddenly grabbed her from behind. A cord, maybe a wire, was wrapped tightly around her neck. The attacker never spoke, but from his size, his strength, and the vague outline in the darkness, she was sure it was a man. An adult. Big. Strong. She blacked out quickly, but recalled a searing pain in her lower body just before everything went black.
There were no clear facial features, no tattoos, no scars, just a shape.
Still, it was something. Forensics, meanwhile, offered both clarity and frustration. The wound patterns were eerily similar to Lam Tu's. Investigators noted that the attacker didn't just slash or stab. He reached inside the body and pulled out the intestines by hand without damaging surrounding organs. No blunt force trauma, no signs of hesitation. It was methodical. Surgeons speculated that the killer had either medical training or experience with animal butchering. The dissection was deliberate, clean, almost practiced.
That narrowed the suspect pool.
But rain had once again washed away footprints and fingerprints at both scenes. No DNA was recovered from either victim, not even a partial match. Police began revisiting prior incidents. The attacks on Ms. Tao and Ms. Ban took on new weight. A rough sketch was compiled based on Ms. Ban's description, a large man with a square jaw and a faint scent of alcohol.
The sketch was shared discreetly among investigators,
and someone recognized it. A detective recalled a recent case involving a man named Qiáo Jiànguó. He'd been involved in multiple minor assaults, harassment, theft, even a domestic complaint. Nothing had stuck, nothing serious. But his name kept showing up. Born into a blue-collar family, Qiáo was the youngest of 5. Spoiled, hot-tempered, known to drink heavily and disappear for days. He'd been in and out of reform school, even spent time in jail for theft and assault. No steady job, no education. And he had a brother also known to the police. Qiáo wasn't on anyone's radar for murder. Not yet. But something about him unsettled the task force. When shown the police sketch, 3 witnesses, including Ms. Ban, confirmed it looked like him. She even remembered his regional accent. Others agreed the body shape and height matched.
But here's where it gets strange.
Just as the pressure to arrest mounted, Qiao's girlfriend showed up at the station. She was calm, confident, and adamant. Qiáo, she said, was innocent. They were planning to open a noodle shop together. She'd been with him almost every night. He was talking about marriage, about a future. How could a man dreaming about wedding cakes and restaurant permits also be removing intestines in back alleys? Detectives were torn. Then came a breakthrough. 2 local residents, casual acquaintances of Qiáo, reported that on the night of Qiáo Jiànguó's attack, they saw him near the crime scene. He was covered in dirt. His hands were scratched and stained, maybe with blood. They assumed he'd been in a drunken fall. Then another couple who lived above the alley where Qiáo Jiànguó was found remembered hearing a scream. Looking down from their window, they saw 2 figures struggling. In the darkness, it looked like a domestic argument. They didn't call the police. When shown a lineup of 20 photos, Qiáo Jiànguó identified two men whose build resembled her attacker. One of them was Qiáo Jiànguó.
At this point, all the pieces, while not definitive, pointed in one direction.
A profile, a pattern, a person. The task force moved in, but they wouldn't find Qiáo on the streets.
He was barricaded inside his home, and he wasn't coming out. By now, the investigation had narrowed to one name, Qiáo Jiànguó.
The evidence wasn't rock solid, but it was mounting. Sketches matched. Witnesses linked him to the scene. A survivor had pointed him out, and forensic experts couldn't ignore the possibility that the attacker had anatomical knowledge, or simply enough brute strength and cruel instinct to fake it convincingly. So who was he? Qiáo Jiànguó was the youngest in a working-class family. His father had worked construction. His mother cleaned offices. He had 3 older sisters and one brother, Qiáo Jiànmin, who'd also had run-ins with the law. But while his siblings held jobs, or at least tried to get by, Qiáo seemed determined to sabotage every opportunity life handed him. He dropped out of school early, refused to work, drank heavily, got into fights. By the time he was 18, he'd already served time for theft. A few years later, he was arrested again for assault, then again for illegal possession. Then again, this time court-mandated rehab for drug use. Still, the system never held him for long. Family members admitted they'd tried to help, but Qiáo had changed, especially after a failed relationship. His first and only girlfriend left him allegedly because her parents didn't approve of his criminal past and lack of stability. After that, he spiraled drinking, more vanishing for days, muttering about revenge and betrayal. But even then, murder. This. Police surrounded his apartment building, planning a quiet arrest. That plan didn't last long. As soon as officers in plain clothes tried to approach, Qiáo locked himself inside with his brother. The two barricaded the door with furniture and threatened to resist any forced entry. They had tools, makeshift weapons, and most of all, time.
For 9 days, police negotiated. 9 long, frustrating, exhausting days.
Qiáo was in a highly unstable state. At one point, he shouted from behind the door, warning others not to come closer. His voice was intense and desperate. If anyone wants to be a hero, step forward. But know this, I'm not going alone. Detectives couldn't afford a deadly confrontation. The press had caught wind of the case. Cameras began gathering outside the building. Everyone wanted to know, was this the monster who gutted young women? Then came a twist.
On day 9, Qiao's girlfriend arrived at the scene.
She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply asked to speak to the lead investigator. She said Qiáo was innocent, that the man she loved, who was planning to marry her and open a business, couldn't be the same man who'd committed those horrible crimes. She brought texts, phone records, a calendar. They were always together, she said. Always. She didn't just believe in his innocence, she guaranteed it. And truthfully, the detectives weren't sure what to believe. If Qiáo was the killer, he hadn't left a single fingerprint. No hair, no weapon, no blood, no confession. Yet, eventually they struck a deal.
They told Qiáo they wanted him to submit to a urine test for drug use routine, they said. To make him feel safe, they allowed his mother and girlfriend to escort him downstairs.
And when he stepped into the courtyard, surrounded by 20 officers in plain clothes, they arrested him on the spot. What happened next surprised everyone. In the interrogation room, Qiáo admitted to 2 assaults, the attacks on Ms. Tao and Ms. Ban. He claimed both happened while he was drunk. He was sorry, he said. He didn't mean to hurt anyone. But when detectives brought up Lam Tu and Qiáo Jiànguó, his face hardened. It wasn't me. Again and again and again. For hours, he refused to budge. If you have evidence, show me. If not, kill me. I didn't do it. But then something changed. Officers leaned on him harder. They played recordings of witness statements. They showed photos from the crime scenes. They talked about public outrage, the families, the media storm, and the punishment he could face. Slowly, his resistance began to crumble. At 5:00 p.m., after hours of silence, Qiáo looked down and confessed. He claimed he'd attacked Lam Tu out of rage after she stood him up. He said he was drunk, furious, and that something inside him snapped. As for Qiáo Jiànguó, he claimed it was a mistake. He thought she was someone else. He lashed out before realizing he had the wrong person, but by then it was too late.
That confession would send shockwaves across the country.
But not everyone believed it. And in the courtroom, neither did he. By January 2005, the entire city of Kamzo was on edge. Media dubbed him the organ killer. Some saw him as a monster, others weren't so sure. Qiáo Jiànguó, wearing a worn military-style coat, was brought into court under heavy guard. His face betrayed no emotion, no shame, just quiet defiance. The trial opened on January 6th and the charges were serious. 2 counts of attempted murder, 1 confirmed homicide, and multiple sexual and physical assaults. The prosecution leaned heavily on his confession. They painted a portrait of a man ruled by rage, shaped by failure, and capable of inhuman cruelty. But when Qiáo was asked to speak, the courtroom gasped. He recanted everything. "I never killed anyone," he told the judge flatly. "They made me say I did. The confession, that wasn't mine. I was pressured, bullied, tricked."
He admitted to the assaults on Ms. Tao and Ms. Ban. "Yes, those were real," he said. "I was drunk, I acted badly, but Lam Tu Hoa, not me."
His lawyer echoed this claim, arguing that the entire case hinged on a coerced confession and a shaky photo ID by a traumatized teenage girl. There was no forensic evidence tying Qiáo to the murder scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, just his own words given after days of stress threats and manipulation, they argued. And there were inconsistencies. Tu Hoa initially picked 2 men from a 20-photo lineup. She had never clearly seen the attacker's face. The assault happened in darkness. In a state of trauma, could she have confused one man for another? More troubling, the second crime scene where Tu Hoa was found had been preserved well. No rain, no cleanup, but somehow, still no fingerprints, no shoe prints, no traceable hair or fiber. The attacker hadn't worn gloves according to medical experts. So how was there nothing?
The defense pointed this out again and again.
Even Mrs. Ming Tu Hoa's employer voiced doubts. She told reporters she'd seen 3 unknown men loitering outside right before Tu Hoa's scream. "They were acting strange," she said. "I didn't think much of it then, but now, I wonder." The lead surgeon, too, raised eyebrows. With over 30 years of trauma experience, he said the method of internal damage suggested someone with anatomical precision. Not something the average person could do, he told the court. Even trained ER surgeons would struggle to do what was done in that short time and in that exact way. And Qiáo, no medical training, no work history, no indication he'd ever handled surgical tools. Still, the prosecution pushed hard. They argued that criminals adapt, that the lack of evidence could be due to rain, poor visibility, or just plain luck. And most importantly, they had his confession. Whether under pressure or not, he had admitted to details only the killer would know.
On January 17th, the court issued its verdict. Guilty, death sentence.
Qiáo Jiànguó remained stone-faced. Then he filed an appeal. The case went to Tien Shui Intermediate Court. In a surprising move, the court overturned the immediate execution and called for a second trial, citing insufficient evidence and concerns about how the confession was obtained. The second trial was held behind closed doors, raising even more suspicions. Media, family members, even the public were barred. The secrecy only fueled rumors.
Still, the court reaffirmed the death sentence, but this time with a twist. Execution suspended for 2 years, pending further review and good behavior.
The message was clear. The state wasn't fully convinced either. But they couldn't let him walk. And yet not everyone was convinced they'd caught the right man. Some, including people close to Qiáo, had begun pointing fingers elsewhere, towards someone much closer than anyone imagined. After 3 trials, countless testimonies, and a nation gripped by fear and fascination, Qiáo Jiànguó was sentenced to death with a 2-year suspension. And yet, the case felt far from closed. While some viewed it as justice served, a growing number of voices from doctors, lawyers, and even eyewitnesses began to raise a chilling possibility. What if the wrong man was sentenced? Even the surgeon who operated on Tu Hoa expressed doubts. "I've seen many violent injuries," he said, "but the damage here, the precision, pulling the intestines from that angle in that time frame, this required more than rage. It required knowledge." Qiáo, he claimed, lacked the anatomical skills. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a butcher. He wasn't trained in any form of dissection. How could he do this perfectly? Twice the doctor asked. Even experienced surgeons would need longer than 10 minutes. Others questioned the lack of physical evidence. In the second attack, the crime scene was dry, undisturbed, yet no fingerprints, no DNA, not even a shoe print. If Qiáo didn't wear gloves and didn't use a weapon, why was there nothing? Then came the most disturbing possibility of all. Qiao's older brother, Qiáo Jiànguó, died by suicide shortly after the verdict. At first, police assumed it was related to his drug use, but rumors swirled. Some claimed he'd fallen into a deep depression. Others said he'd argued with the family over the case. A few believed something darker, that Jiànguó may have been the real killer. He matched the physical description. He had a longer history of violence. And most alarmingly, he looked just like his younger brother. A woman close to the family recalled, "When they stood side by side, you couldn't tell them apart in the dark."
Was it possible? The police got the wrong brother.
Qiáo Jiànguó, still suffering from trauma, had only seen a shadow in the dark. A shape, a scent, a voice. She picked the closest match from memory, but was it his? And then there's Qiao's own behavior. During the 9-day standoff, he had every chance to escape, to go out in a blaze of violence, or to take his own life. But instead, he surrendered peacefully. Why? If he'd truly committed such monstrous crimes and knew execution was likely, why not end it on his own terms? Some say he confessed under pressure, not from physical abuse, but from the overwhelming weight of interrogation, isolation, and hopelessness. He just wanted it to be over, his lawyer said later. So he said what they needed to hear. Still, the confession was vivid. He described emotions, timelines, and methods that weren't publicly known. That detail, that authenticity, was hard to ignore. So we're left with a haunting divide. One side believes the courts got it right, that Qiáo was a broken man who snapped twice and tried to erase his guilt by claiming innocence. The other side believes a troubled, low-level offender was scapegoated, punished in place of someone more elusive, more experienced, and maybe already dead. And the victims, Lam Tu, 19, a daughter, a sister, left in a muddy ditch with her body mutilated beyond recognition. Qiáo Jiànguó, 17, forever scarred, traumatized, alive but not the same. To this day, people in Qamzhou still whisper about the case.
Some lock their doors tighter. Others look sideways at former friends and wonder.
And somewhere in the shadows of this already chilling story lies one question that refuses to rest. Did justice really find the right man? Or did the real killer vanish with his secrets, leaving behind a name that never belonged to him? What do you believe? Was the right person convicted, or is there still more to uncover?